Welcome back, everyone, to the FBS podcast. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into profit and loss statements, also
Mhm.
called P&L statements. And we're doing this for you guys out there, especially those of you who are maybe mid-career looking to sharpen your financial skills.
Yeah, these statements, they can really be a powerful tool for anyone who really wants to, level up their business acumen. And having a good grasp of your finances is really essential, whether you're running a business or just managing your own personal finances.
Okay, so let's just start with the basics. What exactly ISE, a P&L statement?
Well, in essence, it's basically a financial report. It kind of sums up a business's performance over a certain period of time. It shows how much money the business pulled in, how much they shelled out, and, at the end of the day, whether they made a profit or ended up in the red.
So it's kind of like a way to see if a company's, in the black or in the red, like
Yeah,
you said.
exactly. And to really get a handle on how it works, let's kind of break it down into its key parts, take a look under the hood.
All right, let's unpack this thing. What's the first thing we're going to see on a P&L statement?
So the first thing you'll notice is revenue. And that's basically the total income a company brings in from its main business activities.
So let's say for like a coffee shop, right? That would be all the money they make from selling their coffee and pastries and stuff.
Exactly. Now, right after that, we have what's called the cost of goods sold, or COGS for short. It's pronounced just like the word cogs.
Okay, COGS, got it. What all goes into that?
So COGS includes all the direct costs that go into making the goods or services that the company sells. So for our coffee shop, that would be things like the coffee beans, the milk sugar pastry ingredients, and even the wages of the baristas whipping up those lattes.
So it's basically all the expenses that are, tied to making the products that bring in the revenue.
You got it. And when you take that COGS and subtract it from the revenue, you get what's called gross profit. And that tells you how much profit the company is making from its main business before you even factor in other expenses.
So it's like the profitability of the coffee shop's core business.
Yeah.
Just making and selling those delicious coffees and pastries.
Exactly. Then you've got operating expenses, which are those costs that aren't directly related to production, but are still necessary to keep the business running. Things like rent for the shop, utilities, marketing, and salaries for the folks handling the administrative stuff.
So it's kind of like the overhead costs,
Yeah,
just keeping the lights on and the doors open.
precisely. Now, when you subtract those operating expenses from the gross profit, you get something called operating profit.
Okay, so operating profit gives us a clearer picture of how profitable the business is after we consider all those day-to-day costs of actually running the coffee shop.
Right. And finally, we arrive at what's called net profit, often called the bottom line. This is what you get after you take the operating profit and subtract any non-operating expenses like interest payments on loans or taxes.
So net profit, that's the final word on how profitable a company is after you've accounted for every single expense.
Exactly. It's basically a report card on the overall financial health of the business.
Now, the Forest Business School, or FBS, has given us a real-life example to help us understand all of this. It involves a 45-year-old sawmill owner named Ryan who runs a company called Touchwood Millworks.
Right. And Ryan, he actually uses P&L statements all the time to track his business's performance and make smart decisions.
So let's take a look at his P&L statement, which FBS was kind enough to provide for us. According to his statement for last year, Touchwood Millworks made $572,000 in total revenue. But his cost of goods sold, or COGS, was $495,000. So that means his gross profit was $77,000.
Yeah, and then after you take into account his operating expenses, things like rent for the sawmill, insurance, salaries for his employees, his operating profit actually went down to negative $8,000.
So even though his business made a good amount of money, the costs of running the sawmill and actually making his products ate into his profits.
That's right. And after factoring in loan interest, his net profit ended up being just $2,000 for the whole year. This basically shows us that he's operating on pretty thin margins, meaning the profit he makes on each dollar of sales is pretty small.
So Ryan's P&L statement, this is a great example of how these statements can give us a quick snapshot of how a business is doing financially. But I'm sure there's a lot more we can learn from these statements.
And, before we get too far into it, I just want to remind everyone that the Forest Business School, FBS, we're all about helping mid-career professionals like yourselves really boost your skills.
Yeah.
And understanding these financial statements, like these P&Ls we're talking about today, that's a big part of what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, before we went to the break, we were looking at Ryan's P&L statement for Touchwood Millworks, right? And we saw that while he had a good amount of revenue, his costs were pretty high. So his profit margins were kind of thin.
Right, and that's why it's super important to look beyond just the bottom line.
Yeah.
A P&L statement can tell you so much more about how financially healthy a company is if you know what to look for.
So it's not just about seeing the final profit or loss number, but understanding what all goes into it.
Right. Exactly. Like one of the most important things to look at is the trend over time. Are revenues going up year after year? Are expenses staying about the same or are they creeping up? Looking at these patterns can give you a better idea of where the company's headed financially.
So even if a company's making a profit in a certain year, you got to see if they can keep that up in the long run.
Exactly. Another important thing to consider is the gross profit margin. This tells you how much profit the company makes on each dollar of sales after they cover those direct costs of production. Having a healthy gross profit margin is really key for a business to be successful over time.
That makes sense. Because if a company isn't making enough profit on each sale, they're going to have a hard time covering all their other expenses and making a profit overall. But how do you know what a healthy gross profit margin is? Does it depend on the industry?
Oh, absolutely. What's considered a good gross profit margin can be totally different depending on the industry and how the company does business, like software companies. They often have really high gross profit margins because their products are pretty cheap to make. But manufacturing businesses, they might have lower margins because their production costs are higher. The key is to compare a company's gross profit margin to others in the same industry.
So context is key.
Yeah.
A 10% gross profit margin might be amazing for one industry, but terrible for another.
Exactly. Now, another thing to focus on when you're looking at a P&L is operating expenses. Are they going up faster than revenue? Are there any areas where costs seem really high? Digging into these numbers can help you figure out how efficiently a company is being run.
It's like looking for any waste or things they could be doing better that might be hurting their profits.
Yeah. And finally, you want to look at the net profit. Is the company consistently making money? Is the net profit margin increasing over time? These are the real indicators of how healthy a company is financially and if they can create value.
So even though we need to break down each part of the P&L and look at it separately, it's really the net profit that tells the whole story.
Pretty much, yeah. The net profit is like the final result of all the other things we've talked about. It's the bottom line?
Okay, so we've gone over some of the important things to look for when you're trying to understand a P&L statement. But how can we use this in our own lives? Let's go back to using these ideas for personal finance. How can someone who's not a financial expert use P&L statements to their advantage?
Well, like we mentioned before, you can apply these same ideas to your own finances. Think of your income like revenue and track your expenses just like a business would. This can help you see where you might be spending too much or where you could save some money.
So it's like making your own personal profit and loss statement to see where your money's going and how you can get a better handle on things.
Exactly. You can
Wow.
put your expenses into categories just like businesses do. Things like housing, food, transportation, entertainment, and so on.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
It's like creating a budget, but you're really analyzing things. You're not just watching your spending, but you're trying to understand why you're spending your money the way you are.
exactly. And just like with a business, you can use this information to make better decisions about how you handle your money. Like, if you see that you're spending a lot of your income on eating out, you might decide to cook at home more to cut back on that expense.
So you're using this P&L way of thinking to get a deeper understanding of your financial habits and then make changes if you need to.
Exactly. It's all about taking charge of your money and making sure you're spending it in a way that helps you reach your financial goals.
I'm starting to get the picture now. What about investing? You mentioned before that understanding P&L statements can help us make better decisions about investing. How does that work?
Well, if you're thinking about investing in a company, whether it's through stocks or something else, you want to know if the company is in good financial shape, right? A company's P&L statement can give you some really valuable information about that.
So it's like doing your research before you invest. You want to make sure the company's doing well and has a history of making money.
Right. You can use the P&L to look at things like how much revenue the company's bringing in, their profit margins, their operating expenses, and their overall profitability. This can help you make a smarter decision about whether or not to invest.
So you're not just watching the stock price or listening to what analysts are saying. You're taking the time to understand the company's financials for yourself.
Exactly. The P&L statement, it's a powerful tool that can help you make better choices about your investments.
This has been super helpful. We've covered a lot from the basic parts of a P&L statement to how we can use them to make better financial decisions, both in our personal lives and in business. Welcome back to the FBS podcast. So we've been really digging into these profit and loss statements and how they can show us, the financial health of a business.
And we've also seen how those same ideas can be used for our own personal finances, to help us make smarter choices about spending, saving, and investing.
Right. Now we've been talking about P&L statements from an investor's perspective. But These statements are super important for the business owners themselves, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
For business owners, the P&L statement is like their go-to tool. They use it to keep tabs on how things are going, figure out what they can do better, and make big decisions about where they want to take their business.
So it's not just looking back and seeing how they did last year. It's about using that information to make better choices going forward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, let's say a business owner sees that their gross profit margin has been going down for the past couple of years. That could be a sign that their costs are rising faster than their revenue. Or maybe they're facing more competition and need to change their prices.
So that would be like a red flag telling them they need to do something.
Right.
Maybe find ways to cut costs, be more efficient, or make their products or services stand out so they can charge more.
Right. The P&L statement can be really good at catching those trends early on so you can be proactive and fix them.
So it's kind of like a roadmap for business owners.
Yeah.
It helps them navigate all the financial stuff and make smart decisions to make sure they're making money.
That's a great way to put it. It's all about using financial data to make better business decisions.
We've talked about this before, but it's worth saying again. Understanding P&L statements can be really empowering for people, even if they don't own a business.
For sure. Like we've said, the same principles we use to analyze a business's P&L can be applied to our own money.
It's about using that same analytical approach to look at our income and expenses.
Exactly. By keeping track of our income and expenses and putting them into categories and looking for patterns, we can get a much better understanding of our spending habits and see where we could maybe save a little more or spend more wisely.
It's like we become the CFO of our own lives, right? We take control of our money and make choices that match our financial goals.
That's a great way to think about it. Understanding your finances, whether it's personal or business related, it gives you the power to make better choices and reach your goals. And the P&L statement, it's a powerful tool to help you on that journey.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into profit and loss statements, the main thing to remember is that they're not just for accountants or financial experts. They're a valuable tool for anyone who wants to be smarter with their money.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Whether you're running a business, managing your own money, or thinking about investing, understanding P&L statements can give you a real edge.
And it's not as complicated as it might seem. With a little bit of effort and a willingness to learn, anyone can understand the basics and start using this knowledge to their advantage. We encourage you to take what you've learned here today and start looking at your own finances like a P&L statement. What can you learn? What changes could you make to improve your financial situation? Knowledge is power, and understanding your finances is one of the most empowering things you can do for yourself. Thanks for joining us on the FBS podcast.
Hey, this is Steve Bick with the Forest Business School. Thanks for listening to the FBS podcast, and I hope you will subscribe. The truth is, these deep dives barely scratch the surface of some of the topics we cover in the Forest Business School programs, and the podcast is a way of reaching a wider audience. Check out my website at vtfbs.com for more information. Reach out if you want to talk about one of the FBS programs or have custom training or project needs that you'd like to discuss. Again, thanks for listening to the FBS podcast.